Hello, everyone. My name is Keri Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this, our second key data update of April 2026. Actually, our second key data update of the week. Thank you for everybody who joined our session on Tuesday when we actually had a look at the current state of the market and some of the changes that we have seen in terms of market updates. We are very pleased to hear a lot of positive feedback about that session, so we really appreciate that. And thank you again for joining this session, which is the last one from April. And today is a very, very interesting session. We're going to talk about fees, in particular, how universities here in Australia are setting their fees for 2026. It has been quite a very, very different approach this year. And I think the data is giving us some valuable lessons, and we are very happy just to share some of them with you. This year, as probably you know, we have been collecting fees for international students in Australia, but also in New Zealand for many, many years. And in this particular year, we have seen a very significant change on how universities are approaching the complicated topic of setting prices. And this year in particular, we're also very pleased to celebrate 10 years of looking at international student fees. This 2026 analysis of Studymove is our 10th. So we are extremely thankful. Every time we're thankful, but this one in particular, when we saw that it has been 10 years of the making, it's taken an extra special just to receive your support. And thank you again to everybody who has been supporting us in this journey, and in particular this year. And it's great for us just to hear from you that the data that we provide and the analysis is really helping universities, because as I said, setting a pricing is quite a complex process. In particular with universities, there are so many things that have to be considered that actually I'm going to explain in a second. So knowing that we are actually helping you, it's actually really important for us. As you know, we actually collect the data looking from the student perspective. So we love to look at what is on your websites, and basically we collect all that information and we spend a lot of time just cleaning the information, making it relevant and useful. And this year, in particular, we are very pleased that we have a really good set of data reports that I think they are equipping you and your teams just to understand the changes in the market. In particular, we have noticed that it has been very popular, our traditional analysis of fees that I'm going to take you through in a second, but also universities are putting a closer look at two areas. One that is scholarships, that also I will include in the presentation. But also, and I think this one makes sense, universities are also looking not only at the international market, but also at the postgraduate domestic market, where they actually need to set their fees for many of their programs. And they're just trying just to see what are the opportunities just to, in some way, manage these restrictions that are in the international cohort, see how the postgraduate cohort in some ways can actually compensate the operations and the engagement with applicants here in Australia and all around the world. So if you have any questions or any more information, please let us know. And we are always happy to help. Okay? All right. So let's just get into the data. And this, in particular, this report is probably one of my favorites that we put together, because it's telling us a lot about, and this has been year by year, a lot of the thinking that comes from every university. And for us, as I said, this particular year has been quite interesting to follow, because I think that this is the first year where universities really had to face fully and embrace the current policy framework. I think when universities set their fees in 2024, actually the policy framework was just really cooking. Then in 2025, it was a lot of uncertainties, but this year, although there were still uncertainties, I think that universities, they knew how to respond. And for that reason, we really want to share this information with you to understand the approach that everybody's taking. And of course, the other part of this puzzle of pricing is how universities are reacting in the use of scholarships. And we'll have time also for Q&A, but if through the presentation you have any question, please just drop it and we'll take care of that at the end of the presentation. Good? All right. This year in particular, really want to highlight that it's very important to understand the context on how universities set the 2026 fees. Uh, I think that we all know that in particular universities and the way in which we operate, there's a lag in the cycles and our procedures that sometimes they just correspond to the pace of the market. In particular with fees, for example, we know that some universities they set their fees 2 years in advance or at least 1 year in advance. So to understand the 2026 decisions, or actually a setting of fees for 2026, we need to understand what happened in 2025, because that's when universities were deciding how to approach this massive beast, which it was the introduction on the changes in the policy framework. And we all know that it's a policy framework that is constraining the number of students, is looking for managed growth, which means is very low growth in the number of commencements. And with that on mind, I think it's important first to understand that, yeah, we have restrictive policies, but the actual core aspect of the 2025 policy or the way in which the policy was affecting 2026 came unfortunately quite late. It was in August, until August, when the government announced an overall indication of NOSCs for university. It was in August when they said, look, everybody in general is going to have at least the same number of NOSCs that you had last year. And then it was until October when it was the announcement of the additional allocation of NOSCs, like those 9% that they said we're going to distribute across some universities, that came in October. The initial announcement of August is actually very late when you are setting fees for a group of students that are going to start in February. So you only have a few months really to adjust it. And this actually put a very uncertain, I think, approach in how really, first of all, market will change and how actually the policy will affect the operation of universities. So I think that back in 2025, the state of mind of universities was like, we better play safe with this and let's just see what happens, basically. Uh, and that actually creates a very interesting context for how universities responded. And this is what you see on the screen, the historical average annual international fees in Australia. You're going to see the trend. So this metric that you're going to see basically is for every single program offered across Australian universities, we actually take for each university the annual international fee. Let's say it's 25,000 per year or 60,000 per year. And then we group them and we actually get the average. And that gives an indication of how historically universities have been responding. As you can see, in 2020, it was the first time that universities thought, oh, because of COVID, we cannot increase our fees more significantly. So fees were a little bit with a slow growth during the time of COVID. Then we had the big recovery. And this year, we actually have 43,670 is the annual cost of studying a postgraduate program in Australia, and 42,199 for an undergraduate program. Now, these represent an increase of 6.5%. And let me just put it in context because, to be honest, I was personally, and we were very surprised about this result. And now with that, we have been digging in, we have a better understanding of what this means. So this is the average increase. This is the actual percentage. As I said, during COVID, it was a slowdown in the increase because we had border closures. And then we actually have this one, which is 6.5%, as I said, which is the highest increase that we have ever recorded in about 10 years. Now, the question here is, why universities respond like that under such an uncertain circumstances? And this is what I think is very interesting. And there are a lot of lessons from this for this particular year. So 6.5% was the response because it was mainly driven by the financial requirements, not necessarily the market conditions. And in fact, 6.5% is only the average because what we saw is that many universities actually went beyond 6.5%. And this, what you can see on the screen now, is every single university, the average increases that they have. So as you can see, some universities even went above 18%, really high numbers. We have some increases of about 10%. Just to put in perspective, let me show you the same chart, but with the increases that we had in 2025, which they were definitely not as large as what we had this year. So I'm just going to go back and forth. So you can see definitely universities, they increase in average more their fees in Australia in comparison to what we did last year. Just to put in perspective, last year we only had 10 universities that increased their fees more than 6%. And this year we actually had a double. We actually had 21 universities that increased their fees more than 6%. So once again, I think that is very important just to understand and to realize what happened in here, but also what are the effects of these significant, in my opinion, significant increases in fees. So as I've been saying, setting fees is actually something that is quite complicated for universities. We have been saying and acknowledging this for many, many years. To start with, universities have a large portfolio of programs. We don't have only 5 different products or 5 different services that you can align to market conditions, and you can take the time just to see from your few products that you are selling what is the right pricing condition. Some universities actually have 100 programs or 150 programs. So it's very hard just to look at the effects of each one of them. That's the nature of what we do, but that's definitely one of the challenges. The other issue that we have is that we need to set one fee for everyone around the world. So we're actually exposed to changes on exchange rates, which haven't been very significant this year, I have to say that, but it's something that we're actually keeping a close look into that. But that's actually another big challenge. Like, your Bachelor of Commerce is actually priced at 40,000 Australian dollars, and that had to work in many, many different audiences. If you think about many other companies, they are able just to have price differentiation across different markets. We cannot do that. But probably the main difficulty that we have in our sector is that, in one hand, we need to understand where is the market going, but in the other hand, we actually need to reach the financial goals of the institution. And this is when I think that the decision of universities this year was mainly driven by these financial requirements. I think in this very complicated balancing of market conditions versus financial requirements, I think the data is really telling us that universities, under this uncertain, in particular, policy environment that could really just cap your numbers, the right thing to do was just look at increase the fees so you can actually reach or hoping to reach the financial requirements that the university was aiming for 2026. And this is actually quite interesting because, just go here, okay? Because although the policy framework is restricting the number of commencements, what from a financial point of view, I think was the way to move and where universities could actually do something, it was actually in the continuing student cohort. So basically the fees that are set not only affect commencing students, they also affect continuing students. And that's the one where I think universities felt that they have some level of control. Commencements, let's hope for the best. And that's why, in order just to compensate the effect of the policy framework, I think that's when the decision was mainly driven by financial requirements. So you can actually, universities could hope just to reach that revenue that it was required. Now, I'm not saying that this is the right approach or the bad or the wrong approach. I'm just basically sharing that it seems that that's what definitely was in the university's mindset, when it was this decision of setting the prices at the highest level that we have seen in many, many, many years. And I think this also underlines one of the effects of the changes in the policy framework. Universities, they need some reassurance in what's going to happen next year so you can actually make better decisions. Because at the moment, when your NOSC allocation comes in August or October, there is no room really just to compensate or to pivot some of the changes. So something that we are hoping is that in the year we'll have more reliability and probably the periodicity of the policy framework changes, so universities are able just to basically understand what's going to happen. We have been called for 2-year NOSCs allocations, so it would be great if universities know in advance what's their allocation for 2027 and 2028, but that's something that hopefully it will be considered by the policymakers. Now, the other thing that happened is that remember that the government in August announced that they will be doing a 9% additional NOSC. And I think it was a miscalculation on this announcement. We know that some parts of the university sector thought, oh, 9% additional NOSC means automatically 9% growing commencements, which we know is not going to happen in 2026. I can actually say that is very likely that is not going to happen. But it was this idea of, okay, that means that the market will be growing. But the fact that we have more seats on the theater doesn't mean that the market is responding in that way. So that also, although it was very welcomed by everybody, and I think we're welcome to have more space, that actually was a misinterpretation of what were the market conditions. And that's exactly the point that we are trying to make also today. And we're going to try just to look into more detail when there is a mismatch between the financial requirements of the institution and the market conditions. It could be an effect in the total revenue. As I said, I think that the approach it really helped the universities to obtain revenue from that continuing cohort of students. Once again, I'm not saying it's the right or the wrong thing. I think that's the rationality. But I think when we need to start thinking how market conditions are changing, I think this is when we start seeing some of the potential consequences of increasing the fees so significantly. And this is because, in particular this year, and I have to say, this is quite new. This is something that we haven't seen. The market conditions are actually changing very quickly. And things that it was very difficult to see in August last year are actually hitting some universities now in this first semester of the year. But I think that this once again shows how important it is just to have a good reassurance in the policy framework and more visibility so we can actually respond in the best possible way to the changes that we are seeing in the market. And I'm saying this because, for example, we saw an increase in fees of about, as I said, 6% in bachelor programs, but also the same thing in postgraduate programs. And unfortunately, the market is not reacting in the same direction. We know that bachelor programs are actually have increased, looking at the data from last year, but we know that the postgraduate cohort is actually decreasing. We had a decrease of 9%. So it seems that this restriction in the policy framework at this stage is actually affecting definitely the postgraduate cohort a lot more than the bachelor cohort, which I think that if universities kind of knew this in advance and could actually understand this market condition, probably they will actually have a different approach on how they were increasing their fees for their master's programs versus the undergraduate program. But this is something that it has been changed quite rapidly. And I understand that it was very hard to see, but it's something that it has to be put in consideration when it's the next round of setting fees for next year. Now, the other one that it has been quite interesting is this one that I mentioned at the start, which is the challenge of dealing with a large portfolio of programs. And we also have noticed that the market is changing for very different discipline areas. And I think that it has been very complicated for universities just to foresee the changes in the markets and align those changes with their pricing strategies. And let me just show you some charts about that. To start with, I would like to say that we identify 9 universities this year that apply a uniform increase of pricing across all programs. So basically, that was just a very centralized directive view of saying all our programs is 3%, which once again, I think that heavily is driven by financial goals rather than looking into detail of how the market is changing and how other competitors are aligning their fees or not to particular discipline areas. And something that we are very proud of our particular set of reports is that we actually not only look at the big numbers, we actually look at the 11 discipline areas, and we provide a very clear overview of what's happened in each discipline area. And this is important because every discipline area is actually changing quite differently. On average, for example, this year, every discipline area had an increase of about 5 or 6%. That is actually very different when you see university by university. Everybody's aligning very differently. But as you will see, even though the increase was of about 5 or 6%, the change in the market is very different across discipline areas. For example, we had agriculture that had a -8%. We had education that is having some great years with an increase of 17%. But then we had, for example, others that instead of growing are actually decreasing, basically signaling us or basically showing that the market is actually not entirely understanding the value proposition for those particular programs due to the change in the policy framework and other market conditions. And once again, we know that setting fees is extremely complex, and that's why we like to give you all the data when you actually get the reports. But if you could actually look into two in particular field of the studies, yeah, because I know it's very complicated, my suggestion is just to look at these two at least. We know that information technology commencements and management and commerce, which is basically business, represent the vast majority of commencements across most of the universities. It's not all the case, but for the majority of universities, this is the whole bulk of the programs of the students. And as you can see, unfortunately, those are two of the broad field of studies that actually are showing decreasing commencements. So if the market is going soft and we are increasing their fees, maybe that's a very challenging value proposition to put into the market. And that's one of the things that I think we need to put in consideration. Now, this is actually more evident when we look at postgraduate programs. And as part of our analysis, we look at all the study levels, and this is just postgrad for information technology and management. So information technology programs had an increase of 5.9%, management and courses of 6. They represent 55% of the commencements for postgraduate education in Australia. But as you can see, are the two areas or the two disciplines where we're actually seeing the largest decrease in commencements. I think this is when some universities are facing some difficulties just to get students, because at the same time that we actually had an increase in fees, we actually see a softness in the market. And this is once again when it is extremely important just to look for that good balance between the financial requirements of the university, but also the market conditions, because if we don't align to the right market conditions, we simply are not going to reach the target of the students that are required to reach the financial goals of each university. So those are actually something that is very important just to have in mind. And once again, usually, well, what I've been sharing is just the average, but I really want to share with you the actual distribution for all the universities. And this year we couldn't believe that we saw universities nearly increasing their postgraduate fees by 25%. We have another one by 15%, 10%. So very significant increases that I don't think that unfortunately aligns to where the postgraduate, at least business programs market is actually going. So it's important just to have that in mind and really have a good understanding of what's happening in that particular area. Now, if we really think about the financial view about it, I think that that's when some universities thought, well, the bulk of my students are here. or my continuing students are here. So that's when actually can compensate. But as you can see, there is a clash between those two views in this particular year. Now, another thing that we have been doing, and it's quite interesting also to look at, is we have been doing this analysis of rankings and fees. And that's something that also has been very well received by many universities because we know that there is a relationship, clear relationship between the ranking of a university and their average international fee. So we do this looking at the QS World University Rankings, but we also do that looking at the Times Higher Education Rankings. Now, overall, in 2026, this relation is still valid and exists. And I know that people actually can argue about the role of rankings, but the reality is that international applicants, they do look at rankings as a point of differentiation. And that's why universities that actually align that in their pricing strategies. So as I said, this year the correlation remains strong overall. So the correlation is basically if you get a 1 or a -1 is a perfect relationship between two variables. We actually had 0.73, which is a very strong correlation for QS, and also 0.76, which is a very strong correlation for the Times Higher Education rankings. Now, once again, where we're starting to see some interesting approaches is when we look at the discipline areas, because something that we do is we don't only look at the big rankings, we also look at the ranking and the fees. In the case of QS, we look at 21 discipline areas. And in the case of Times Higher Education, we look at 16 discipline areas. And when we look into the detail, that's when we identify some decision-making process that probably are not really working well in the market. In particular, once again, this is business and management. And as you can see, there is still a relationship, like universities with lower ranking, they have lower fees. But if we see this group in here, which is the universities in Australia that I have the top ranking for business programs, you can imagine who are they. They suddenly, instead of following the trend, they became all very clustered. It's actually 6 universities who have, I think it's only $1,000, the difference between one and the others for business program. And that I think that the market is having difficulty to understand that. I think that the market is like, yep, I know that you're very well-ranked universities, but there has to be some point of differentiation. And in fact, a couple of years ago, we did a similar approach and a similar analysis across the New Zealand universities, because the New Zealand universities, from a pricing point of view, they like to get next to each other. And we identified that that actually creates a problem because for applicants, it's very hard just to understand the different value proposition of each university has. Why a university that is well ranked, but it's based in Brisbane or in Canberra or in Adelaide, have the same pricing that the ones who are in Sydney or in Melbourne? This is not for me to decide, but this is the questions that I think applicants are actually making. And I think is making the actual a presentation of the value proposition of each university a little bit harder because we don't have that price differentiation. So these clusters, I don't think they really work, or they actually are forcing universities just to explain in more detail what is the differentiation between one and the other. But definitely this was, I think, another result of a pricing decision that is probably more driven by financial factors than the market factors. And I'm hoping that this is not affecting the results of universities, but I have the impression that this is what the market is thinking. This is not exactly, or they're actually a little bit confused on how we are actually presenting our pricing proposition. Now, the other big aspect, of course, of pricing is the scholarships. And we know that the scholarships have played a very important role in some markets more than the others. But that's something that we have been following, not as extensively because we have been doing this, I think, for 6 years, not 10. But I just want to share with you some of the main findings of our scholarship report because What I think is happening is that some universities, because we have these constraints just to move our pricing strategy straight away, we need to wait until the next year. This is when scholarships they play an important role just to adjust to some things that the market is not responding accordingly. And we have seen that it has been an increase in scholarships, but the approach it has been quite different. And let me just explain you what we have seen in the market. So as I said, we have been looking at this for quite a long time. This is from 2018, but I'm just going to show you the latest one. So what we have been doing is we collect all the information of scholarships available for new international students. We spend a lot of time classifying and curating, looking for what is the relevant scholarships, because sometimes there are some particular merits for I don't know, like very things that necessarily they are not part of the marketing strategies of universities. And overall, what we have seen is that for many years, since 2021, universities have been moving away from the use of scholarships to the point that in 2025, we actually saw the largest decrease on the offering of scholarships. But the numbers that you see there is the number of programs available to new international students. And as you can see in the arrow, we actually had seen a slight increase, basically a little bit of a tick going back to the use of scholarships. And what it has been fascinating is that we collect the first set of data for scholarships, I think it was in October, just to see how things were moving. And then when we revisit the analysis and basically collect again the information in February, just to see if it was a big shift, that's when we saw the peak. So this is something that universities in particular clearly are doing just to basically, in a way, compensate to some changes in the market that, in my opinion, probably is a result of a way too higher or higher than the expected increase in fees. As I said, what I think is interesting is that, yes, the whole scholarship engagement is going back, but it's going back in a slightly different way. What we saw in the past is that we saw a lot of like big fee waivers that they were covering every single student around the world. And I think that universities are clearly more mindful about the effects of having a big umbrella scholarship. Definitely this year, we see that there is a small increase in scholarship, but the approach is definitely more strategic. Most of the scholarships are packaged as a merit scholarship, not as a fee waiver. Actually, that's a trend that is actually taken away. So most of them are packaged as a merit award scholarship. And what I think is quite interesting is the fact that they're actually more targeted. This is something that we saw as well last year, but definitely now most of the programs or the way in which universities are presenting their scholarships are actually a country specifics. And I left this slide from last year because last year the country that had the largest number of country specific scholarships, it was India. But this year we saw once again a shift because India is no longer the country that has the largest number of country specific scholarships. The largest number now is Southeast Asia. The number one was Vietnam with 27 universities offering scholarships, followed by Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Cambodia. Now, what I think is fascinating about this is that these actually follow the first direction that the Australian government has signaled to the market in where they want to see the engagement of the market, which is in Southeast Asia. And I think universities are also aligning that policy with the way in which they're actually engaging with the specific markets. And they are hoping that those efforts that will bring more students from that particular region will actually help them in further allocation of NOSCs. So definitely there is an alignment between that direction that the government has given to universities just to basically get more students from Southeast Asia. But as I said, the change is clearly into country specifics because also this year we saw that 79% of universities so pretty much everybody, is offering courses per country-specific scholarship, which is higher than 67%, two-thirds were last year. Now it's close to 80%. So that's one of the big shifts that we have seen in terms of scholarships. Also follow that big shift in terms of being more strategic. But the only one that, to be honest, I was expecting and I haven't seen, and there's something that it requires further analysis, is that we still see that a lot of the scholarships offer are for the complete duration of the program. In other places, like I gonna use the example of New Zealand, for example, the scholarships are only for the first year of the program. And specifically universities, I remember asking them and they said, we just don't have the financial resources just to keep a scholarship for the whole year, for the whole duration, sorry. So that's why we only use it for the first year. I know that there is obviously an ethical issue and probably a market thing on that, because if they don't have enough resources for the second or third year or the second year, there is an issue. And I think that's why universities are understanding that. But at the end of the day, also, it has a more financial cost, full duration scholarship than a first year duration scholarship. So that's something that I was expecting that maybe will be a few shifts, but no, we haven't seen any big changes, at least in this year. All right, so I hope that this set of data help you just to have a little bit of a better understanding of where we have seen the change of fees, which, to be honest, it was remarkable to see this high increase in fees, which we actually believe that it was driven more for these financial requirements, which unfortunately is sometimes not aligning to what we see in the market. And I really hope I'm wrong. And I really hope, because I don't see numbers for February or March, but I really hope that this is not affecting the actual efforts to get new students into 2026. Because in some instances, I think the increase is quite significant and maybe it's not really aligning to the level of competition that we have seen in the market. But I'm just saying that. And I think this year is going to be a big lesson on how we actually are balancing these two very important factors. In terms of scholarships, yep, there's definitely a rise in the use of scholarships with a more strategic view and definitely with a country-specific focus, in particular in Southeast Asia. But I really want to underline two things that are very important. Of course, for us, we truly believe that having access to good data to make the decisions and to support your pricing and scholarship strategies are really, really important, because that's the only way that you can see what competitors are doing, but also at specific levels like broad field of study. But also, I really want to highlight that this shows how important it is just to have certainty in the policies. And we just hope that in the next round, or starting the next round in 2027, 2008, the NOSC allocation is actually coming earlier. It comes with more clarity. I insist, 2 or 3 year NOSC allocation, at least, or a base of your NOSC, will really help universities just to make decisions with more clarity and certainty, because otherwise, I think what we're going to see is that universities are going to have to take a more conservative financial outlook, because the uncertainty that comes from how many students I will get, new students, is going to be greater and greater. Or more importantly, the revenue that could come is going to be greater and greater. Okay, so if you want more information about our reports, please let us know. I think DBT has been sharing some of that information on the chat. These are our baseline reports. If you find anything specific, we can actually do that as well for you, because we have the data. So sometimes universities, they just want a program-specific analysis. We're more than happy to do that. And we just, once again, want to thank you not only for joining this session, but for all the support that you have been giving us in the last 10 years, and in particular this year. We're always happy to help, but definitely something that I didn't expect after 10 years of doing that is that at the 10 years, that's when we'll see the greater level of volatility. But unfortunately, that's what is actually happening at the moment in the market. All right. So thank you so much again. It's great to see you. And I think we have a few questions, and I will actually look into them as well. And if you have, okay, essay. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much for everybody for joining us, and thank you, Christina, for your comments. I really, really hope that this is useful. There is obviously a deeper conversation that has to happen. As I said, every university is now in a very, very different approach. We're happy to help you, and if you need more information about our reports of our analysis, please contact me. We're very happy to help you. And thanks again for your time, and we'll be in touch very time soon. Right here. See ya.